Hello and welcome. My name is Victor Gijsbers and I teach philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. Today I want to talk about a very recent article in the philosophy of time. It is called An Empirical Argument for Presentism and it was written by David Builes and Michele Odisseas Impagnatiello. So Builes and Impagnatiello are going to defend presentism. And one of my aims in this video is going to be to explain to you what presentism is, what the sort of dialectical situation is with regard to presentism, how do philosophers think about presentism, what do they think its strengths or weaknesses are, and then I'm going to explain to you, at least in rough outline, the argument given by Builes and Impagnatiello. Now, maybe I should say in advance that I myself I am completely convinced of the truth of presentism and that presentism is probably pretty much a minority position in the philosophy of time. So I am, so to speak, in the same camp as Builes and Impagnatiello, and so I am going to be quite receptive to their argument, and in fact I'm going to be, sort of endorsing their argument more or less completely. So let's start at the beginning. What is presentism? Well, actually, that's already a fraught question, and maybe in a different video I would go much more deeply into this, because one of my own research areas at the moment is about how to define and present presentism. But for now, I'm going to take a sort of relaxed approach and use more or less the standard definitions of these philosophical ideas. And then presentism would be the philosophical idea that only the present is real. So the present, like the world as it is now, this sort of three-dimensional world that is extended in space, but not in time, that is the world, that is reality. Okay, so that is what presentism claims. Reality is just the present moment. Against presentism, there are several possible options, but I'm going to talk about only one of them, the most important one, which is eternalism. And eternalism is the claim that no, the world is not just a three-dimensional present. Like the world, reality, is four-dimensional. It extends in space, but it also extends in time. And so the past is real, the present is real, and the future is real. They're all, in a sense, equally real. And of course, if for us the present has some special meaning, well, that's sort of maybe a psychological fact, or it's a fact a little bit akin to the fact that the place where I am has a special meaning for me, right? I care especially about the room I'm in, about the city I'm in, or something like that. But that's not because it's more real than other places. And so the eternalist, the non-presentist, thinks that the present is just like that, right? Maybe you and I care a lot about this moment of time, but that's because we're here. And it doesn't mean anything about the reality of this moment versus the past and the future. Okay, so presentism claims that the present is real, and eternalism claims that past, present, and future are all real, and the world is sort of this four-dimensional whole. Now, many defenders of presentism claim that presentism is, in a way, much more intuitive or much more common sense than eternalism. Because, it seems to fit with what we believe about the world, right? We believe that there are no dinosaurs. And if somebody says, well, but, what about 70 million years ago? We tend to say, 70 million years ago, right? That's when they existed, but they don't exist any longer. So we tend to have sort of this idea that the present is more real. And maybe we tend to have the idea that time, sort of involves some kind of dynamicity, some kind of movement, some kind of distinction between the past and the future that eternalism can't capture. So I'm not going to go into those arguments. They're important ideas. We would like to talk more about them. We're not going to talk about them in this video because these considerations are not central to the Builes and Impagnatiello article. Okay. The greatest criticism against presentism, usually, and there are more, but I think probably the one that puts most weight in the scales in contemporary philosophy, and it puts a lot of weight in the scales, is an argument from science. And the idea would be this. The idea would be, well, first of all, special relativity, the theory of special relativity, has taught us that there is no present, or rather that there is no unique present. Right? Different observers moving at different speeds have different presents. And furthermore, especially the theory of general relativity, has taught us to think about space-time as, well, as space-time, as a four-dimensional manifold, which has all kinds of interesting mathematical structures, but, as a four-dimensional whole, not as the three-dimensional world that presentism presents to us. And so, again, there's a lot more to be said about this, but the basic move, I would say, in contemporary philosophy of time, at least contemporary analytic philosophy of time, is to say, well, our best physics gives us very good reasons to believe that an eternalist picture of time is better than a presentist picture of time. Okay. Now, as I said, I think there are many questions about that kind of argument. One of the questions is, well, why would physics be sort of an overriding guide to time if there are also these other considerations? And why would the fact that sort of the present, for instance, doesn't turn up in physics be, by itself a reason to believe that the present has no special status or doesn't exist? But again, I'm going to ignore those questions for now because I want to focus on the Builes and Impagnatiello argument. So here's the Builes and Impagnatiello argument, and here's why it's such an interesting move in the argumentative situation that we're in right now in philosophy. What they say is, science actually gives us a very good reason to believe that presentism is true. So against the supposedly best argument in favor of eternalism, which is that it fits science so well, they are going to argue that no, it is presentism that fits science so well. Right? So they really bring the fight to the eternalist in the eternalist's preferred domain. So that is the basic strategy of an empirical argument for presentism. And of course, now we would like to know, well, what is it about science that fits presentism so well? And what it is what Builes and Impagnatiello call Markovianism. They tell us that all the laws that we have, all the scientific theories that we have had, at least since the time of Newton, are Markovian. So let's talk a little bit about what that means. What is it for a physical theory or the laws of nature to be Markovian? So this comes from the name Markov, and it comes from a term that is used a lot in statistical modeling and so on and so forth. But here's what we want to understand about it. A system is Markovian if the way that it's going to evolve in the future depends only on its present state, so only on the way that the system is now, and not on the way that the system was previously, not on the way that the system was in the past. Or, to be a little bit more precise, the way that the system is going to evolve in the future can depend on the way that it evolved in the past, but only because the past influenced the present. So, if I want to predict the future movements of the system, all I need to know is its present state. And then any further information about its history, about what happened in the past, is irrelevant. Right? That doesn't add information that is useful for prediction. So, if a system is Markovian, knowing the situation it's in now is enough to make the best possible prediction about the future. That prediction could be sort of certain in case of a deterministic system. It could also have uncertainties if we have an indeterministic system. Both of those could be Markovian. Okay, so what does that mean in the real world, right? How can we understand this more concretely? Well, if the world is Markovian, what it means is that for the past to influence the future, it has to go through the present. right? So if, for instance, if something that I did yesterday is to influence what happens tomorrow, then it has to do so through the effects that it had on today. So, for instance, yesterday I read the article, An Empirical Argument for Presentism, and because of that, today I have knowledge of this article, I make a video about it, and so on and so forth. If the world is Markovian, then my reading of the article, right, yesterday, if it influences what happens tomorrow, it does so by having influenced today, right? By having turned me into the person who now, today, has this knowledge, makes this video, and so on and so forth. So there are no spooky actions where something in the past, which didn't actually influence the present, now suddenly reappears to sort of influence the future, right? That doesn't happen. Okay, so that is the story about what Markovianism is, and Builes and Impagnatiello work this out in more technical detail, right? They give more precise definitions, they show how to use it when you talk about deterministic and when you talk about indeterministic systems, and I'm going to gloss over that detail, and if you want to know more about it, you should absolutely read the article, which at least at the moment is freely available online. So, do we have good reasons to believe that our world is Markovian? Yes, we absolutely do seem to have good reasons to believe that our world is Markovian. Builes and Impagnatiello point out that all our physical theories, at least since the time of Newton, have this Markovian structure, where if you have like the full state of the system at some time, let's say it at time 0, then you have everything you need to know to make the best possible prediction of the future. And it doesn't add useful information if you are also given the history of the system. It's just irrelevant. It doesn't add anything to that. So our physical theories really do seem to be Markovian, and I suppose that also the way that we tend to think about causation is very Markovian, right? If something happened and it didn't have any effects, right? It sort of petered out. There's no traces of it left. Then it's gone, right? Then it's not going to do something tomorrow because it's gone. That effect is gone. That influence is gone. And it's not going to sort of skip over the present to have some direct effect on the future. That would be very mysterious to us. That would seem to be sort of magical or unexplainable. So Markovianism is yes, a feature of our physical theories. And it's also, I would say, a feature of how we think about the world. Okay. So what does this have to do with eternalism and presentism? Well, here's the basic intuitive idea. Suppose that presentism is true. Then all that is real is the present. And so if anything that happened in the past is to have any influence in the future, well, the only way for it to do so is to have influenced the present. Because if it hasn't influenced the present, then it's no longer there. It doesn't exist anymore, right? Because only the present exists, and so there's nothing there that could possibly influence the future. So if you're a presentist, then clearly everything that could influence the future has to go through the present. It can only be present things, really, that influence the future. It couldn't be past things, except insofar as they have influenced the present. So if you're a presentist, then this Markovianism, this idea that the past isn't around anymore. Well, if you're a presentist, you believe that the past isn't around anymore, and so you believe that there's nothing there that could influence the future, and that gives you Markovianism. This is a bit of a quick and dirty argument, right? You would have to go into a little bit more detail to sort of really show that presentism implies Markovianism, and that is one of the things that Builes and Impagnatiello actually do. They work out exactly what we need to believe about presentism and what we need to believe about the world in order for it to follow that Markovianism is true. And so what they add to presentism is basically a non-Humean theory of the world, right? Where they say, well, look, a Humean theory of the world is a world where there's just events. And there's really no relations of necessity. And so if there's just events and there's no relations of necessity, then okay, the entire sort of question, well, the entire story that I was just giving about only the present is around to influence the future doesn't really work, because this talk about influencing has no meaning for a non-Humean, at least not sort of the standard meaning or the metaphysical meaning that is needed for the argument that I was trying to give. But if you add, a certain non-Humean story about the world, like the world consists of objects which have causal powers, and it's those causal powers that sort of, generate the future. If you add something like that to your presentism, then you are going to get a story that leads us to accept that Markovianism must be true of the world. Okay, so much about presentism and Markovianism. And again, there's more technical detail in the paper, so if you think it's interesting, check it out and see exactly how the argument works. What about eternalism and Markovianism? Well, if you're an eternalist, then all the past and the present are just there. In fact, the future is also just there. And so there doesn't seem to be any reason at all why the world would have to be such that present events alone are enough for the best possible prediction of the future. I mean, why wouldn't past events, which are also real, which are also around, so to speak, why wouldn't they have just as much chance or just as much, power, if you want to talk that way? Why wouldn't they be just as relevant for predicting the future as present events? I think one might want to go even further. I mean, why don't future events have that relevance, right? I mean, why wouldn't, if you want to predict what happens in 1 year from now, why wouldn't events 1,000,000 years from now be just as relevant as events from the past? But okay, I'm not going to go into that, right? Those would be questions about causal asymmetry or temporal asymmetry, the distinction between past and future, and whether causes can only go from past to future. I'll not go into that, though I think it's a real issue for the eternalist. That's not what Builes and Impagnatiello are interested in. They are interested in this Markovianism, and they point out that for eternalism, well, it's not that eternalism and Markovianism are incompatible. I mean, you could have eternalism be true, so the past is real and the present is real and the future is real, and for one reason or another, the laws of nature happen to be Markovian. I mean, you could have that, but it would be a completely unexplained fact, right? The fact that the world is Markovian, that our laws of nature have this feature, is unexplained, right? There's no metaphysical reason for it. And so now we can see how their argument works, right? So what you see is that the world is Markovian. This is a pretty striking feature, actually, about our physics. And that feature is explained by presentism, but it's not explained by eternalism. And so we get something of an inference to the best explanation, or an abductive reasoning, where we say, well, if presentism explains this fundamental feature of our physics, and if eternalism leaves it a completely unexplained coincidence or fact, then that is a good reason, not an indefeasible reason, not a reason that couldn't be trumped by other arguments, but a good reason to believe that presentism is true. Certainly, right, in the dialectical situation of the philosophy of time right now, where people say, well, okay, one thing that's really great about eternalism is that it fits science so much better. You can say, well, actually, maybe presentism fits science better. And that is one of the things that Builes and Impagnatiello actually say. They say, well, okay, I mean, eternalism maybe fits this story about the now or the uniqueness of the present a little bit better, but there are many ways to get out of that. Whereas this Markovianism, I mean, that seems to be a really fundamental feature of the world that only presentism explains. So actually, presentism and physics go very well together. So that's the overall shape of the argument. And again, I think it's I'm inclined towards presentism, so maybe I'm biased, but I think it's a good argument. To be honest, I'm a little bit surprised that apparently there are no articles defending this argument before. I mean, it seems to be the kind of argument that is hanging around, that maybe you can find sort of people consider or put forward, even if they don't work it out, in previous literature. But I don't know whether that actually happens. It would be very surprising to me if it's completely new. But I think it's great that some presentists have actually gone to the trouble of sort of working it out in technical detail and presenting it in what I think is exactly the right way to counteract certain tendencies towards eternalism in the contemporary philosophical literature. So, I more or less completely agree with that for whatever that may be worth. I suppose the one thing that worries me a little bit, if worries is the right word, one thing that is an intriguing question for me is whether the title of the article is right. So the title is an empirical argument for presentism, and I'm wondering how empirical is this? Right? I mean, if you're a presentist, do you really think that, okay, it also could have been the case that the past was real, but for empirical reasons, I believe that in this universe, the past isn't real. And that seems a little bit weird to me. Right? I mean, it seems to me that these are the kinds of metaphysical theories where we're really trying to understand the nature of time. And if the nature of time is such that the past can't be real, I mean, if that's just not what time is, or how time works, or how we should think about time, then it seems that in some ways this couldn't be an empirical question. On the other hand, it seems to be the kind of question where, what science finds is relevant. And so I'm not sort of pushing forward an answer here, saying yes, it's empirical, or no, it's not empirical. But I do think there's a big methodological question mark here. And I would be unwilling to sort of stand up and embrace the claim that what we have here is a truly empirical argument, rather than maybe in some sense an a priori argument, maybe somewhere beneath the physical story. Well, be that as it may, I hope the argument was clear to you. I hope it's interesting to you, and I would certainly advise you to explore further this, at least for now, freely available paper by David Builes and Michele Odisseas Impagnatiello, an empirical argument for presentism. Thank you.